On today's episode of the Locked On NHL podcast, burning questions ahead of the season for the Avalanche, the Stars, and the Oilers. Money issues for Edmonton. When will the Stars finally get over the hump? And is this an audition for other teams for Alexander Georgiev?
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is happening, everybody? Welcome into the Locked On NHL podcast, your daily NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team each and every day. We thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen each and every day. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe on YouTube and your favorite audio platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On NHL is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On today's episode of Locked On NHL, we dive into burning questions for the Colorado Avalanche, the Dallas Stars, and the Edmonton Oilers. 3 teams with postseason and Stanley Cup aspirations this year, and some implications for beyond this season for all 3 as well. My name is Seth Toupal, host of Locked On Wild, joined on this wonderful Western Conference Tuesday by JD Young of Locked On Sharks. And we continue to get closer to the start of the season, JD. We've got some prospect showcases going on this weekend that is kind of the unofficial kickoff to the preseason. And so it is full systems go. And it's full systems go for all 3 of these teams. All expected to be near the top of the standings this upcoming season. But some very interesting things that need to be answered. If all of them are going to be successful, these are questions that are going to have to be answered for all 3 of these teams. And we can start with the Colorado Avalanche. The biggest one for us was just which of the non-Nathan MacKinnon, Mikko Rantanens, who is going to be the one that steps up and has the biggest season to help those guys out from a scoring standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this, earlier this season, and especially or this offseason, with some of the issues they have with their roster, right? Gabriel Landeskog, who's still out right now, he is expected to be back some point this season, but 1, you don't know when he's going to be back, and 2, right, how long does it take him to kind of ramp back into being the Landeskog we all know and love? Like that's not a guarantee for when he comes back, especially after missing an entire season like he did last year. It's gonna be a season plus, and then Valeri Nichushkin, who's also off the ice as well. Those are 2 huge pieces. And for Colorado to, kind of be one of those teams and kind of be a Final Four team or make a run for Stanley Cup here, they're going to need somebody else to step up, right? We know McKinnon's an absolute maniac, won the MVP last year. Mikko Rantanen, who's also amazing. I feel like he scores like 6 goals every time he plays the Sharks. In contract here, Mikko Rantanen as well. But we know like Stanley Cups aren't won off 2 players' backs. Like you need to have those second, third, fourth line guys be able to step up in big spots here. And I think that's going to be the question for us is who among these guys is going to be? Is it going to be like a Casey Middlestat, who they acquired at the trade deadline last year, or Terry Lehkonen, like Jonathan Drouin, one of those type of forwards to step up and help add some of that secondary scoring so it doesn't have to be, Nathan MacKinnon or Cale Makar every night. You need these guys who can kind of step in and take over a game every once in a while.
It is interesting. You key in on Casey Middlestat, and you look at the circumstances that led to the Avalanche going and getting him. Was they just had a void on that second line center spot, and he comes in and has 10 points in the final 18 games of the season with the Avs, 4 goals, 6 assists. I think he definitely is somebody that can really help this Avs team out, because you look at MacKinnon, You look at Rantanen, you know you're going to get production from those guys over the
Mhm.
course of the season. But if they can go from a team that gets, high impact production from one line and you kind of are rolling the dice 2, 3, and 4 after that, if he can turn that second line into one that you can expect, 65, 70% of what the McKinnon line can give you, that's where this Avs team gets really dangerous. And you look at the numbers that he put together with Buffalo, had 47 points in 62 games. He was at .76 points per game. Little dip with the Avs, but if he can get back towards that level and can be, an 18 to a 20 goal type guy for this Avs team, that's a huge boost. That's a huge help to them as they try to put that offense together. But you've got these kind of consummate professional guys that just have it's the Avs find these guys every season and just plug them into the lineup. Ross Colton, Arturi Lehkonen, Jonathan Drouin, but also some sneaky guys that were brought in to just be depth pieces like Joel Kiviranta. All these guys, it seems like that they pick up have a nice uptick in scoring. And so it's going to be really interesting to see because Jared Bednar is pretty darn good at pulsing the lineup, kind of feeling out who plays well with who. And so it might take them a few games just to kind of see how these combinations work out. But it's not going to surprise me at all if 10, 15 games into the season, Bednar's got a pretty good idea of who rolls well with who and that this team really starts clicking.
Yeah, would it surprise you if at the end of the season we're talking about how Middleton kind of has this breakout season and he's like a potential 70, 75 point player, especially when you have Nathan McKinnon drawing so much attention. And then if Landeskog comes back and, you pair those two together to have a nice 1-2 combination on your top two lines, or Middlestad's just a super overqualified third line center, then I think for Colorado, it's how much can you kind of hold on until Landeskog gets back to, even if it's 90% Landeskog or, something like that. So, I think the forward depth is a huge question. I think another burning question that you alluded to is the goaltending, which was, I think, held them back at times. I know they, again, dealing with issues last year, but the goalie situation wasn't good. We know Colorado, when you pay all these guys that you're kind of paying up front, or your Cale Makars and stuff, you have to kind of go cheaper elsewhere. Is Gorgiev, who's in the last year of his deal, is he going to be a guy that they look to replace or look to the future potentially?
I mean, it is. I think if you look at the questions for this Avs team beyond this season, I think other than health to guys like Landeskog and the status of Nichushkin as well, it's probably the single biggest issue that they're going to be facing going forward, because you look at the numbers, and for Gorgiev, a 3.02 goals against average and an 897 save percentage is not going to get it done. And here's where it gets interesting, because you've got Justus Annunen, who in 14 games, it's a small sample size, 14 games, he had a 2.25 goals against average and a 928 save percentage. So if you can take Gorgiev making $3.4 million, if you are confident that a Noonan can give you even enough to be like a 1A, and you go out and you get somebody to be the 1B for like $1 million, $1.5 million, you've saved money there. And at that point, then, like we've talked about, every penny counts with this Avs team, with all these extensions that'll be coming up. Mikko Rantanen coming up after this upcoming season. And if Gorgiev has another season like he did, because he had some stretches where he was really, really good, but as we've seen with him, there just are those other stretches where you're like, we can't win with this type of goaltending. And so if a Noonan gives them anything this year, it wouldn't shock me in the slightest if they just hand him the reins, bring in a capable backup, and call it good.
Yeah, you wonder too, maybe with the workload, Gorgiev played 63 games last year, for the Avs. Maybe if you get that down to like 50, and then, you know, a Noonan as he's kind of ramping up here, and maybe now he is like a 32 game starter, and see how he does with a bigger workload, and maybe kind of help split it. And then you maybe get a better where Gorgiev's not having to kind of carry the load so much, and maybe he's a little bit fresher, you know, and going kind of looking at even their goals saved above expected last year in all situations. Gorgiev saved 5 goals saved above expected in 63 games. And Noonan had 11.5 and 14. So that's basically almost a goal saved extra per game with his performance. So again, we'll see what happens if maybe you ramp that up. But would you be surprised if Noonan is the starter going to the playoffs for that next year?
No. If you go with that type of a split, if he gets like 30 games and he's the better of the two, that would not shock me in the slightest.
Yeah, you wonder too if secretly, especially since he's locked up for the next couple seasons here on a very, you know, the next 2 seasons on under $1 million, if the Avs are secretly hoping that he kind of wins this out so they can kind of move, like you said, move on from Gorgiev, and then they can find another cheap backup to kind of play behind in Noonan for the next couple seasons. So, and yeah, wouldn't surprise us. So
time will tell, because it's with the Avs, there are playoff aspirations and cup aspirations every season. So you really can't afford a misstep in any of those key areas, and goaltending is one of the most key areas for
keyest
the keyest areas. I don't know. So it wouldn't shock us at all. Look, I am embarrassed as much as that went that my lights got brighter. It happens. We go from one team with high aspirations this season to another team that is hoping to finally break their glass ceiling. The Dallas Stars. Is this the year they finally break through and advance? We'll discuss as we continue today's episode of Locked On NHL. After this, we are your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On NHL is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, you've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, we have something a little different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial on NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out of market game when all you need is a Google account, their current form of payment, and you can cancel any time. I was floored this past weekend on Sunday that there was just one game on in the noon slot.
Noon slot. 10 a.m. slot, buddy. That's the way to go.
You and your Pacific time zone.
10 a.m.
You never have to worry about that happening ever again if you get NFL Sunday Ticket. And if you're looking for an easy way to throw $5 down, as we've talked about all season, just go find the team that the Chicago White Sox are playing and throw $5 on them to win, and you're set. So whichever options you go with, whichever bets you throw down, just make sure that you visit FanDuel.com to download America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On NHL. We are your team each and every day, and your first listen each and every day. Make sure for your second listen today, you check out Locked On Fantasy Hockey. We're getting close to the start of the fantasy hockey season. NHL season is coming right up, so fantasy hockey as well. I have just been reminded this week of the crushing agony that first week injuries in a fantasy team can provide. So make sure that you take this opportunity to be fully ready for your NHL fantasy drafts so that you know who to pick up as injury insurance so that you're not left with one running back after week 1 of the fantasy football season and all backups that don't play. Awful. But that's my fault. Locked On Fantasy Hockey will make sure that you avoid my mistakes with your fantasy draft. All right. getting back to our discussion, let's move to the Dallas Stars. Burning questions for the Stars. And JD, you and I were in unison with this one, because if you look at what has happened for the Dallas Stars the last 2 seasons, they've won in the first round. 2 years ago, 2022, 2023, they beat the Minnesota Wild in the first round 4-2. They beat the Seattle Kraken in the second round 4-3. They then lost to the Vegas Golden Knights 4-2 in the Western Conference Finals. This past season, they won in the first round against the Vegas Golden Knights 4-3. They won in the second round against the Colorado Avalanche 4-2. And then they lost in the conference finals to the Edmonton Oilers 4-2. And for a Dallas team that has won 99 games the last 2 seasons,
It's pretty good.
they have just not been able to get that one step up the ladder additional. Is this the year that they finally do?
That's the question, right? Like this is a team that's kind of sneakily in transition too. Joe Pavelski retired. They have guys a lot of guys entering veteran guys entering the last year of your deals. Jamie Benn, of course, the stalwart, has been there for 1,000 years. Matt Duchene, who they got on the cheap. Like you have Tyler Seguin's got a couple years left. But you also have kind of the guys rising up. Maverick Bourque, who I think is going to make a big impact this year. Logan Stankoven, who's a potential Calder candidate. Wyatt Johnson, who really broke out last year. And it seems like the changing of the guard at the same time as a team that's trying to make a run at a Stanley Cup. So it's either going to be the perfect blend of young players and old players, or this feels like maybe a potential step back season as your young guys are kind of making that leap. So they're one of the most fascinating teams this season, just because of, I feel like they have I wouldn't be surprised if maybe they're a wild card team and get knocked out in the first round, or they could be one of the best teams in the whole Western Conference just because of how talented they are. They're a very intriguing team to me.
I have real questions about their defense beyond Miro Heiskanen and Thomas Harley, and you could throw Issa Lundell in there too. Matt Dumba, I've had a chance to see him play for
You've watched
a while.
Plenty of Matt Dumba. Yes.
Yeah. And I think it's pretty clear what Matt Dumba is at this point in his career. Like, he just is, and it all stemmed from that injury fighting, I think it was Matthew Tkachuk. It was one of the Tkachuk brothers. When he tore that pec muscle, like his career trajectory changed entirely. But they brought him in because he's starting to kind of transition to a physical defenseman. And he's a good locker room guy. And honestly, I don't think it's a coincidence that they brought Matt Dumba in after Joe Pavelski retired, because I think while you can mask what Joe Pavelski brought production wise with Wyatt Johnston and Logan Stankoven, that's a huge void to lose in that locker room, having a guy who has been there as long as Pavelski has. And so I think Dumba was brought in part to help with some of that. But Dumba and Ilya Lyubushkin, they're not known as defensive defensemen. They're offensive guys. And so if you get matched up against a team that has a similar type of offense as the Stars do, like, what are you going to do to combat that defensively? Like, are you going to throw Heiskanen and Harley out there for 25, 28 minutes a night? Like, it's a concern. And so that would be one thing I think that would probably prevent them from going all the way, because any sort of weak spot that you have on your team is just, it is exploited and it is beaten to death in the postseason. And so if they don't find a way to upgrade that back end, or if those guys don't at least play like passable defense, that's going to be an issue.
Well, the good news for them is they have a ton of cap space. They have $6 million right now, heading into this season. They still have to re-sign Thomas Harley, and that's going to be an interesting contract. Like, do they go kind of a bridge contract? Maybe they try to lock him up long. But anyway, like they still have money heading into this offseason, and they'll have plenty of cap space, I think, at the trade deadline. So if they do want to be aggressive and they have their own first round pick, and they have prospects that they could swap out. So I think Dallas, if they want to try to upgrade that one of the defensive spots, I think they can do that. But yeah, it's gonna be interesting though, like replacing Joe Pavelski. Doug Wilson, the Sharks former general manager, came out and said that was his biggest regret, was not re-signing Joe Pavelski in his entire career. Doug Wilson, who was GM for almost 20 years, that was his biggest regret, was letting Joe Pavelski walk. And it was basically over 1 year because Pavelski wanted a 3-year deal. Doug Wilson wanted to sign him to a 2-year deal. And you could kind of see that moment from there. The Sharks, much different team without Joe Pavelski. So, but yeah, I think, for Dallas, like they still have a lot of pieces. I think if these young guys can play better, I think they can fix the defense, especially in the bottom six or the bottom pairing if they do have some issues there. But another kind of long-term question is Jake Ottinger, who had his ups and downs last year, is entering the last year of his deal at $4 million. He'll still be an RFA, so the Dallas will have his rights, but can he be the guy to lead you to a Stanley Cup?
That's a good question because he is such a big, he's a big goalie, and he has always been a guy that if he can get to his spot and get set up, he is really hard to beat.
Yep.
The key for him has been, if teams can get him out of position, they usually have, and you can say this with a lot of different goalies, but I think especially in Ottinger's case, if you can get him out of his position, if you can get him off kilter, you can really feast. And, he had a dip in games from 62 to 54, which is, 8 games. It's not a huge drop. He did battle injuries throughout the year, but you look at some of the peripheral numbers, you go from 2.37 goals against to 2.72. That's a hike. That's a large jump. And his save percentage went from 919 to 905. Like, that's a bump. And it's going to be really interesting because a lot of times if your goalie needs time to kind of get in rhythm, that's where a defense can help kind of bail you out. And I mean, it's going to be really interesting to see because it'll either be something that Dallas, they figure out and they're able to rise above it. But if not, then it's going to be one of those situations. And trust me, I've been there myself watching this Minnesota Wild team over the last few years. It's either going to be something that they find a way to not make a regular season issue, or it is going to bite them every night. And it doesn't matter if you've got prime Patrick Waugh back there, or you have, I don't know, take your pick. Whoever in net. It doesn't matter if you have the best goalie of all time or just somebody filling the spot. Bad defense can bite you. So.
I believe me.
I don't have to tell you that.
2024 San Jose Sharks. I know plenty about bad defense. So, but yeah, I'm curious to see Ottinger, who is in a contract year, like if he can kind of rise to be one of those elite goalies who can, put a team on his back when they need him to. We've seen him do that in times, like you go back to that series against Calgary where he was just lights out.
Insane
in that series. It's just insane, and drug them to a game 7, but RAP Johnny Gaudreau, what a still insane goal. But you wonder if he can kind of maybe reach that level. Maybe the injuries are starting to mount up, or maybe he's finally healthy now. and can kind of get bounced back to form. So I'm curious to see Ottinger, one, how do we see the transition from some of the older guys to some of the younger guys? And if that can be the juice to kind of make Dallas break through finally, and can Ottinger be the guy? I think they're the two biggest questions.
It's funny how much it comes down to goaltending, because the next team that we're going to talk about, huge questions about the goaltending as well, although there are some other big burning questions for the Edmonton Oilers as well. We'll discuss as we finish today's episode of Locked On NHL after this. One final segment of today's episode of Locked On NHL. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen each and every day. Again, for your second listen, make sure to check out Locked On Fantasy Hockey. Get the lowdown on which players on your favorite team you should be targeting in your fantasy drafts. I'll give you a hint. Whether you are a fan of the Minnesota Wild or not, Brock Faber and probably Kirill Kaprizov should be on your list. So Locked On Fantasy Hockey will get you as close as possible to nailing your fantasy draft, although if you draft like I do, it doesn't matter. You can be as prepped as possible, and you're still going to not.
Are you when you do your drafts, are you like a super prepper, or are you just kind of go in there and go with the vibes?
I prep a little.
Are you one of those guys like where as soon as something goes wrong, the whole thing just goes out the window?
I prep some. Like, I'll do a few mocks, and I'll at least kind of have an idea of like, here are situations that are good. Like, I don't necessarily look at players to draft. I look at situations to draft from. But the thing that always throws me off is there are people that like fill their lineup out in order as opposed to like where you would naturally draft people. And so you've got quarterbacks going in like round 2, and I'm like, okay.
That's why I just do. That's why auction's the best.
I have done auction quite a bit, and I will endorse the fact that it is highly better than a snake draft. Like, go spend the money if you want to have the players. Speaking of spending the money to have the players, what a great segue that was. The Edmonton Oilers, coming off of a trip to the Stanley Cup final and nearly hoisting the trophy themselves. The Oilers with some big questions this season, as you would expect with the team that has two of the best players on the planet. A lot of it comes down to money.
And Derek Ryan.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, definitely those two. It comes down to money, and it's not getting Leon Draisaitl on the books because they've already done that, but it's what happens with the next deal, which is coming for Connor McDavid.
Yep. Yeah. You've spent a lot of money on Draisaitl, and he's very good. I think worth every penny. I'm also very much in the star players are vastly underpaid category, especially in the NHL. When Draisaitl is going to be making the same as like a bench player in the NBA, salary cap, I know, et cetera. But McDavid, like if Draisaitl signs for 14, like McDavid's 16, 17, like you're probably going to be spending about $30 million between those two guys. You still have Darnell Nurse on the books until the sun explodes. You're going to have to pay Evan Bouchard after this season, who I think had his breakout season last year. He's still an RFA, but you assume you want to try to lock him up at some point. Stuart Skinner's got 2 years left on, like, you're going to have to make some cuts and try to find ways to save money elsewhere. And, that doesn't even Ryan Nugent-Hopkins is making $5 million. Zach Hyman is making $5.5 million. Like, how do the Oilers, one, try to win a Stanley Cup right now, but also two, at least keep an eye on the future of like, we have to try to find ways to shake some money off here at some point, or do they just say screw it? If you win a cup and the banner's up there, you don't really care about the cap situation after that. But like, you have Evander Kane who's making $5 million, and he's probably going to start the season on LTIR. Like, how do the Oilers kind of fit everybody in here and keep surround McDavid with pieces while also paying McDavid every penny he's worth?
Well, and the other thing too, like you run into the situation like you just had with the St. Louis Blues. It won't happen all the time, but you get a roster that is as full up as the Oilers roster is, and you have some guys that are viewed as like these could be critical pieces for the Oilers coming up. You might have teams that are like, well, I'll go fish that out of your prospect pool, and then you end up, kind of getting double hampered by this. And like you nailed it. Players like superstar caliber players like Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl are worth whatever price it is to keep them. This is just the reality of having those types of players on the roster, is that because there's a salary cap, you have a finite amount of money available to allocate for a full roster. And they're worth a ton of wins on the top end, but then you end up needing to fill the roster out on the bottom side. Now, the benefit is that you have situations like what happened with Jeff Skinner, where he gets bought out and he's willing to go to a team like Edmonton because they're legitimate cup contenders. He's willing to go there for less to fill a key spot on that roster. So you open yourself up to those types of scenarios, and there will be plenty more of those. I mean, Corey Perry was another one for them.
Even Adam Henrique, who $3 million, like perfectly capable player, getting underpaid. You would say probably at $3 million. That is the benefit of having superstars, is you're going to have guys who are trying to win championships come and play for less money to hopefully win a championship, but still like. Like how do you still feel like how do you fit? You can't just have a bunch of $1 million guys on here. Like it's going to be interesting. And then when guys like Evander Kane the guys that you are paying don't live up to their contract status, like what do you you're kind of stuck with them, and what do you do there? Do you try to maybe dump them off to a team, and whatever it takes to kind of get rid of a contract like that? I know, well, actually Evander Kane has a no movement clause anyway, so you can't even do that. Like it's a tough situation, I think, for what the Oilers are going to have to do to try to still build a very competitive team around McDavid while also paying McDavid and Draisaitl and Evan Bouchard and Darnell Nurse. And
it will be very interesting to see how this all plays out. Another big key for the Oilers is going to be what we see from Stuart Skinner. Obviously, he had a very interesting postseason. Like there were some games in which he was borderline unplayable, but he is definitely a big reason as to why the Oilers got themselves within one game of winning the Stanley Cup. Like you can't take any of that away from him because he played really well in some of those games. But it seems like this is kind of the story with Stuart Skinner, is that you get these stretches, and this is not unique to him. This is pretty much all goalies, but you get these stretches in which he looks really, really good, and you have other stretches where you're like, how long can we afford to go with this?
Yeah, and again, I wonder if they brought in Calvin Pickard, who's a veteran goalie. Is it maybe do you try to take a little bit of load off of Skinner and play him, try to make it a more even 50-50 split, so that way when you get to the playoffs, he can be ready to go. And especially we expect Edmonton to kind of comfortably make the playoffs this year. Do you give him some rest heading into the playoffs? That way he's can be the guy going into the playoffs. And hopefully for Edmonton, right, you're not like last year where you dug yourself in such a huge hole where you had to spend half the season playing catch up just to get back into the playoff conversation. I think that'll be a big thing for them, is just having a strong start. That way you can kind of prepare yourself better for the playoffs, kind of like a baseball team setting their rotation right for the playoffs, compared to the baseball team that has to kind of run their starters more just to get in. So I'm curious to see like how important the beginning of the season is for the Oilers to, because again, the regular season doesn't matter, right? Just getting the playoffs for Edmonton, everything is to try to win a cup. So yeah, I'm really curious to see if they can get off to a really strong start. I think that would help their situation much better, especially compared to last year.
Yeah, and just you look at some of the numbers against these teams, like the top level teams in the West, especially. 9 goals allowed in 3 games against the Avs. 1 game against the Dallas Stars, 4 goals allowed. Vancouver Canucks, 16 goals allowed in 3 games against them, and so you get some of that's 4.6 per game. You get those performances against the playoff teams. You get some of the other performances against teams like the San Jose Sharks, the Anaheim Ducks, the teams that you expect to beat handily. And so if his performance increases against some of those playoff caliber teams, that certainly helps as well. But, regardless of which team you are, it seems like goaltending tends to be pretty important for postseason success and just general season success as well. So it's ironic that we went in having different questions, but everyone, it seemed like, had a goaltending question too.
Yeah, I mean, that's you could say that hampered all 3 of them in the playoffs at certain times, and so it'll be interesting to see what they do. I do expect the Skinner to hopefully again. Maybe they can rely on Cal Picard a little bit more to kind of share the extreme Samwise Gamgee, share the load a little bit here, and then that way Stuart Skinner can be a little fresher at the end of the season for him. So that's a perfect way to leave.
I'm speechless. I did not expect you to go to that well, but honestly, it fit perfectly. And so, like you said, I'm just gonna. That's our episode for today. So appreciate everybody tuning in. Make sure to hit the like button on YouTube and to follow on your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any episodes throughout the week of Locked On NHL with our full array of hosts throughout the week. We've got you covered every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.